we will talk about how to build APIs with Symfony, and this is more or less the main part of this presentation. My name is Asmir Mustafic. The story about me is I'm born in Bosnia, grew up in Italy, and currently living in Germany. So it is often when somebody asks me from where I come from, it's always a long story, and I try just to pick one almost randomly. Here you have my Twitter, GitHub, LinkedIn, personal website. If you are interested to know more about me, maybe after the presentation, you would like to blame me for something or whatever. I work mainly as a software architect for PHP application, working for startups that are, most of them are located in Berlin, and helping them to deal with different parts of application. Most of the time is PHP side, but lately even a lot of Docker stuff, and now it's really trend, this containerizing everything. I'm also really active in open source. I contributed to Doctrine. I'm maintaining the GMS serializer. HTML PHP, that is some library to convert raw HTML into a DOM that can be manipulated really, really easily. XSD PHP, and this is some kind of XML-oriented library, but anyway, there are a lot of other projects that I work on. First of all, feel free to interrupt me during the presentation in any time. Questions are really welcome, and there are even some kind of relaxed moment for the presentation because it's going to be relatively long. So even some kind of quiet moment will be a good thing. What I'm going to share today is my personal experience. Take it as personal experience. So I'm not saying it will work in your project. Maybe it will if you have some really specific cases that are really similar to what I was building, but this is mainly a personal experience. And this presentation, you will see a lot of slides, a lot of Symfony stuff, and annotations, and also code. So if you don't like one of these, I'm sorry for you. I will talk mainly about callabout.com. That is a platform to connect sponsors and event organizers. So whoever is interested in sponsoring an event or is looking for sponsors, this was the project that I built. And just to understand in big picture what is, we have the user of the application that has multiple events, has multiple companies, can have n friends that are again users, and can send messages to these users. So this is like the big picture of the whole application. You can see there is a really simple application, and in reality it was a bit more complex. There were a couple of tables extra, but it's just like extra user experience. But the core of the application are just these 5 main entities. And is this a social network? Up to you. I mean, there are users, there are some entities created by user, can be posts or whatever, and why I define a social network is because you see different things depending if you have a friendship or not with the user that has created the event or the company. And of course, you cannot message to him or all this nice stuff. Okay, it's mainly built with Symfony 3.2, the API part, and AngularJS 1.6 is pretty old, but I'm not a front-end developer, and this was built completely by me. Let's talk about API. The first requirements that an API has is to do the job. I mean, so let's not talk about all the fancy stuff the general developers add on top of it, but needs to create to serve the data that are necessary for the website. But of course, the functional requirements of the project are mainly the CRUD. So essentially the product requires that it's possible to create user, create events, create companies, send messages, mark them as read, establish friendship, confirm the friendship, ignore the friendship, request, publish events. So it's the main CRUD operation. But I'm pretty sure that most of your application, I'm not saying that 100% of them, but most of them have at least some 1 or 2 CRUD operation, even if not 100% of them. And of course, there are some extra logic. There is some extra logic like authentication, but it's not often part of the application, but authorization, who can see my event, who can see the organizer of the event, who can see how many people are going to the event, who is allowed to contact me. This is some kind of business logic, or who can to whom should I send a notification for a message that has been received, or a friendship that has been asked or been confirmed. And then, of course, there are a lot of functional requirements that are, the API has to be rich, fast, needs to be scalable, easy to change, to develop, documented, and there are a ton of other stuff that we developers need to take care of. And I would like often to focus on needs to be easy to develop, to change, because okay, I work a lot in a lot of startups, and the change is the only constraint. It is always there, and even if we implement something 1 week, the week after probably they will ask us to remove it and do something completely crazy different. So these are some constraints that needs to be there, and of course easy to use, because the API is for users, often developers, or for other front-end developers that will consume that API, so it needs to be easy to use. And of course, it needs to be documented. But what I mean documented is that the code and documentation must grow together, because otherwise, sooner or later, they will go out of sync. And for me, I generally don't accept the documentation that has a separate repository in a separate format, just because sooner or later somebody will not create a pull request for that documentation feature. Yeah. Sorry, guys. No, but it's not go to meetings. type. This is a one-to-many entity, another one-to-many entity for events and companies. And there is nothing special in it. And probably everybody can understand this code. Identical thing is for the company. Just has a many-to-one relation with the user, and a couple of other fields like who was the user that has created this company and created that, and probably there are other fields that I have omitted by simplicity. Event is identical, just changed a couple of names, but there is nothing magic in it. Connection is what defines like the connection between two users, and again is just from the user to the user, and the status if it's like established or is requested or if it's like cancelled. This is already like some kind of business logic, but there is again nothing really special in it. And the constructor, I like to put in the constructor of entities what is necessary for that entity to be defined. Then what is optional can be used through setters, can be defined through setters. And last of it is the message entity, that again is trivial, at least in my opinion, because has only the ID, who is the sender, who is the receiver, and the text of the message. Again, nothing special. Just one personal doctrine tip is to use universal IDs. They have a lot of advantages, and let's just consider this line of code. We create the user, we print his ID, its ID. We persist the user, we print again its ID, and we flush. This means we persist this user to the database, and we print his ID. Depending on which ID strategy we use, we get really different results and even different performances. Because if we use auto-increment, that is the most common in MySQL, this is what we have. We have 0 query executed on the first echo, and null for the first two cases because the ID was not yet defined. And when the row has been inserted into the database, we have the ID and one query has been executed. If we use sequences that are common for Oracle or Postgres, we have 0 query executed first stage and null. One query executed, this is not obvious because it needs to get the sequence value. And we have the ID. And on the last stage, we have the second query executed, that is the insert, and this just reprinting the previous value. If we use universal IDs, we get advantages of both. We have from the beginning the ID, no query executed, and only at the end one query executed. This is really interesting when you have to compose a lot of entities and you want to call one single flush at the very end. Yes?
To know if on the sequence in Postgres, does it actually increment the...
Yes, it's exactly doing one query.
When you echo the get ID after the persist, does
the
actually go to Postgres?
Yes. Queries increment the sequence, and if you're doing it in a transaction, even if you roll back the transaction, you have lost the value of the sequence. And this is like one query executed, and you have a lot of stuff, can be a lot of queries saved. And this is not obvious because doctrine promise that persist does not do any operation, but in reality it does. So use UIDs when possible. And currently, database is often even native format of universal ID, so it's even space efficient. So Postgres or Oracle are allowed to save universal ID as byte, not as strings. So you will use probably 128 bytes instead of using 45 characters that probably are translated in much more space. Okay, going back to controllers, that was the second part of the First of all, company controller is what is just the CRUD of the company. We need to do get, post, delete, put of the company with a specific ID. This is the controller, and here starts to be a bit more Symfony related, but it's still relatively simple. We have I always tend to have a constructor with a controller, so to not depend on the framework explicitly. And I'm injecting a couple of objects. That is the object manager that is used from Doctrine to save the data. Company repository is what we use to fetch the data. Token storage is what is used by this controller to get the currently logged in user. Can be null if it's not logged in, but in this case, it's just a service that allows to retrieve the currently logged in user. And the form factory is what is used to create a form that we will see later, that is used to handle the validation and which fields are allowed to be sent by the API, example, when creating a user or when modifying a user. But these are just dependencies for this controller. Now we are going to do a step-by-step overview of each single action. Just to, this is again some Symfony specific thing. This controller is a service that was defined in a service XML that we will not see. That is just specifying how to instantiate this. Nowadays, this is even optional because both Laravel and Symfony have auto wiring, so this will automatically find all the dependencies. Sometimes that will not work if you are depending on one interface that has multiple implementation, will not give you the right object, and you will need to define it. This is why I put it there. But this is just one specific case. Let's see the simplest case is how to get a company. That's all. One single line of code, how to get a company. And here there is relatively a lot of magic, but a lot of it is in annotations. Let's go here. This is just saying that the URL of this controller, of this section, is company/id with the ID that is going to be some string. Of course, it's possible to add constraints that the string must be numeric, must be a new ID, but for simplicity, it's just a string. And this action is only for the HTTP method get. This is for what it concerns the URL, and this is how Symfony handles the URLs. Second part is the param converter. This is responsible for being like for allowing to inject here the company directly as entity without having to go through the repository, finding the ID, and do all the stuff that is necessary. That is really boring for me, but it just adds extra complexity on this code, and I generally like declarative code, not procedural. So this is just some convenience to say that the parameter ID of the request is converted into the company. Then Symfony will do all the magic and will guess how to find the company entity, will do the find by ID, and will provide you directly the company from the database. This is another interesting thing, is how to handle security. So am I allowed to see this company? And the thing is just, is granted, company view is the name of a privilege that I have defined, and it's just a string, and saying, am I allowed to view this company? If yes, we'll just go through the code. If not, we'll throw an unauthorized exception for something. So if everything goes well, company will have a value.
Yeah, I was just curious. These annotations, is the security annotation, you're passing company into that?
Yes.
So is the order matter?
No. No, it does not matter. The order is given by how the event handlers are instantiated into the Symfony core.
Right, but the security guy has to know which company it is. It's getting that from the
the thing is that parameter converter, as I remember, should have a higher priority of the security handler. Okay. So wherever it happens, the parameter converter will find the company first, and then security handler will decide if that company can be seen or not.
And the order in the doc log.
The order in the doc, as I know, does not influence. I type them more or less without paying attention, but yeah, probably the best way is just to try it. Okay, good. Interrupt me if you have questions. Maybe I don't realize just because I'm looking here and there. Okay, and returning just the view, that is some, okay, I have omitted in the space, but is a view from the Foster's bundle, just passing the object to show to the user, and the HTTP code that is 200, okay. Nothing else here. Looks relatively simple and is one single line of code without any kind of logic and relatively declarative. There are no conditions that has to happen. Something more complicated, but again, this is the first part. Later we'll see that it gets simpler. We have again company get. This is how to get like a list of companies. Query parameter. This is just an utility, is not necessary, that allows, if you have a query parameter like the name, the place, that are essentially filters of your collection, it allows you to have this array here with all the parameters that are in the get. Looks useless, but the advantage is that has a lot of things like validation of parameters, can be a map, so this place is technically is an array of places. I can define if it's an array of string, if it's an array of integers, how to apply validation. Just adding a couple of parameters here. If they are mandatory, if they are optional, I can put even a description that can help the user to understand what is that field. And the result is that this parameter will be automatically injected into the action. And here I can ask to this object all the filters. And this will be just a raw array with all the filters that has been passed to this URL, and already validated and already filtered with everything that I have specified in the annotation. Request, as this probably is common, is just if I need to extract something explicit from the request, I ask even the request parameter to be injected. And here is relatively logic of the code. I'm counting how many companies are matching this filter. This we'll talk about later. And here I'm extracting the companies that are in this limit, like matching these filters, ordering them by date, and taking a specified amount of companies. And again, I'm returning these companies. That in this case, again, is an array. I'm not doing any kind of JSON stuff. I'm not taking care of what is HTTP, what do I have to do with HTTP. Partial response, we'll talk about later, and then a couple of headers that are for this partial response. Okay, let's talk about this. This is how I like to do pagination of results, is using the HTTP range header. This what requires is a specification of HTTP that instead of adding extra query parameters for limit, offset, whatever, there is a really nice specification of HTTP that they have planned it already 10 years ago, or 20, how to do partial content. And technically, it's just, I don't have an example. It is a range header that says, give me the results from 300 to 500, and this is what, this is just extracting the header from the request. This is just an helper method. And I'm using what I've extracted as a range to query the repository. And of course, then I have to communicate to the client. For example, if the client asks me, give me the first 3,000 users, but if the repository have only 100, I have to tell to the client how many item has been returned. So I'm always counting the number of companies, not what he asked as limit. And then this is just an extra header that is always good practice to add if you're doing range queries, is to avoid some proxies to cache a partial response as complete response. So I'm adding as a key of the cache some extra stuff. But this probably is going out of topic of this presentation because it's something really specific for HTTP, and maybe in your application you don't want to do range pagination, and this some part will be slightly different. You will have to extract range from the query, not from the HTTP header. Yes?
The param fetcher class, is that part of Symfony, or is that something you wrote?
No, it's part of Symfony. Yes. Here, there is no code that I wrote of core libraries or something. Everything is already on other.
Is that from 3?
No, param converter was probably from 2.3. Yes. Yeah, both query param and param converter that was used in the previous, they are really, really old. How to delete a company is, again, trivial. This part is identical to the get. Only thing I ask him, am I allowed to delete this company? Here I'm not specifying who is the user, how was logged in or whatever, just asking, is possible by security rules to delete this company? and if it's yes, it goes through, otherwise not. And the only thing it does is to call the remove action of the company to do the flush. That is something necessary by Docking to do the real delete operation, and then returning HTTP no content. Again, no logic, in my opinion, just 1, 2, 3, and that's all. Post is the most probably complex, but is also the most probably the complex operation to do, is how to modify, or later we see the put, but is almost identical, how to modify a company. This part, again, is identical to get. I'm getting like the company and checking if I'm allowed to edit the company. Automatically have injected the company here. Here I'm instantiating the form in this line. We will see later what are forms, but it's just a nice way to map which field that I'm receiving from the JSON object are going to be used. This is useful to avoid security issues. Is useful to provide validation of fields, to provide example in my database, the data are stored in one format, but I want to receive them from the clients in multiple formats. So it's just one extra layer of complexity, let's call it, but that gives the advantage of having a separate validation and a separate filtering of these fields. And the thing is that validating fields or filtering the input is not responsibility of entities, is not responsibility of controllers, is not responsibility of this part of application, so should stay in a separate class. This is why I really like Symfony forms, and I really hate to see some method validate, and then you have 10, 30, 50 line of code taking care of every single validation possible security issue that is easy to forget and to have your application being hacked by somebody. Okay, when I do the submit, I'm checking if the form was submitted correctly and if it's valid. If it was valid and submitted, I just persist the company. This is possible because the form component will already also do the set of all the fields that were allowed by the form definition to be set in the company. And I just have to flush the company to save it to the database and to return HTTP OK. That's nothing more than that. If it was not valid, I'm returning the form, and this will be handled. Will already show all the validation errors that happened in this form, with all the rules that I can have apply, custom rules or whatever it is. Will be already in some nice format of the JSON response. Put is identical to it. The only difference is that instead of getting the company from the database, I'm just creating a new company. And that's the purpose of put, is to create a new company. Then this line of code are identical. I just, instead of returning HTTP 200, I'm returning 201 should be created. Okay. And that's all. But this method is really identical to the previous one with what just single line of code changed. Okay, this looks relatively complex, and if we have to add all this complexity for all the other entities that we have built, looks like a hell. But let's see the event controller. There is just copy and paste, replace company with event and nothing else. Because since I've not put in the controller's logic, the logic will be coded piece by piece in some other part. But technically there is not logic, because I'm just taking some field from the JSON, I'm persisting them to the database, applying some validation rules, and that's all. So creating the company controller is just replacing the name company with event, and that's all. User controller is identical. So just copy and paste, replace, and I got for free in probably 2.5 minutes if I'm slow, already the CRUD for the remaining two entities. And we will see that making the friendship controller and the messages controller is not more complex than that. I have just to handle a couple of small differences, and some of them are just the dependencies of these controllers, that for the friendship I need a different repository, and I need here a friendship manager. This is necessary for me just because I'm sending an email to the who received a friendship connection to saying, hey, John asked you to connect, would you like to reply or not? And that's the only reason why I have to inject this friendship manager, otherwise it would not be necessary. But let's go just through these sections.
I have a quick question. It's kind of a that instead of maybe another user that doesn't own the company, but they are trying to get information on the company. So they might really protect fields that are only available to. How do you build that in? Because like security you show is like, well, whether they can see it or not.
Yeah, we will talk about it in a moment.
Okay.
Just because it's exactly is one of the part of the presentation. We will see how to handle security right after. Okay. It's almost at the end of the presentation. Okay, friendship is just this, and let's see the. Just one trick that I have here. All the URLs of this controller have prepended /user/user ID /connection, and also all the actions of this controller will have injected a user that is the user ID specified here. So I'm using the param converter that you asked before. Even at controller level, this means that I don't have to copy and paste it for each action, but I just put it on top of the controller, and this will inject. It's not necessary if I don't need it to one application. I just need to declare it, and it will just do nothing. But I can just declare the user, and I will have the user injected in each action of this controller. And also, each action of this controller, I'm checking that I'm allowed to edit this user. So this is, again, some security level. Get method of to see all the friendships connections of this user is, again, relatively simple. We have the route method. Param converter is the friend. Like this is querying actually not the friends, but is querying what is the status of the friendship with this user. Am I friend of him or not, or have I asked to him to be friend or not? So I'm getting the connection. It was a bit more complex to do it with the param converter. So I'm doing a query, find by from to, and I'm returning. Friendship can be null if they are not friends. So if they are not friend, I return HTTP not found. Otherwise, HTTP okay, and will be the status of the friendship. That was some kind of conditional hidden. How to get the list of my friends? As I said, I have the user injected already before. I have the param fetcher. That in this case, I think that was not necessary. Because my application, I copy and pasted the code. I had some filter to see the active friendship, the last friendship, and so on. And here the code is identical to what we saw before. I'm counting the items, extracting the range, finding the friendships connection, and returning the friendship connections. Again, here there is no, in my opinion, there is no logic. I'm just I have copy and pasted the code that was in the first controller, renaming some variables, and that's all. This is a more specific application is how to create a connection, and this again is making a put on an endpoint that has connection /id /connection /friend, that is the friend of the user, the ID of the user. Here, so I have the user injected before by the controller, and this param converter is injecting the friend. So are the two entities that I want to connect together. And here I'm doing the real operation with the friendship manager to establish the connection that is going to send the email and to create some like entities in the database, but I skip this part in this case. And I'm returning just the connection with HTTP to created. Okay, here the magic is done by the connect. The technical is just going to instantiate a new connection object, do the set of user and friend, and to do the persist. But again, nothing special. And here is the security rule that am I allowed to connect this user to this user? This is also like if somebody else is trying to call this URL, trying to connect to users. And also, this is something that I have added extra is, am I allowed to add a connection? Because maybe I have, in my case, I have some different account levels. So if you have premium, you can add up to 10 friends. If you have some enterprise edition, you can add up to 100 friends. But again, this logic should not stay in the controller. And the controller here does not care which kind of plan subscription do I have, but it's just about making the connection.
So the URL is / like the friend ID or the user
No, the URL, as I say, is this, and then appended the friend, because as I said before, what I define on top of the controller is applied for each single action of the controller. So even in this case, the URL is /friend/ all this stuff. How to delete a connection is again all the long URL method delete. I have the friend, and am I allowed again to delete the connection of that user? If the friendship is fine, I remove it and return no content. Otherwise, they were already not friends, so I'm not even trying to delete their connection. Again, there are some small differences, but in my opinion, are only like few lines of code changed here and there. Message controller, I would go a bit faster, but again, it's identical. I have some big route. The message, the user is sending that message. How to get a list of messages for that user. Slates are shared, so I'm going faster, but you can see it is identical to what was before. Create a message, and then there were other extra entities like mark as read action, and conversation is to get a list of people that I was talking about in the last 10 minutes. And again, I'm always using this to check if I'm allowed to do it, param converter to get the entity from the URL, and nothing more than that. Okay, here looks relatively simple. I've omitted the controller and the repositories of Doctrine, but generally they are just few lines of code that are really Doctrine specific, so I will not talk about Doctrine. How to convert, as you can see, I was not talking about serialization yet. And this is done using GMS serializer as library that I said also contributes, so this is some interesting stuff. Just adding some entities, some annotations in the user object. Here I put like, this is just in addition to the previous annotation for Doctrine. I'm saying I'm exposing, oh, what happened? Yes. Exposing just the ID is a type string. Even if it's an UID, UID has the method to string, so it will be converted to string. We'll talk about this in a moment. I'm exposing, for example, the last active date when he was logged in as a datetime and formatted in this way, registered, and then in serializer you can even decide ignore this field. So if I put exclude somewhere, I can exclude completely a field. Or this is something more interesting that was added in the latest release of GMS serializer, that I can conditionally serialize a field or not. And this is partially what is used to not show to non-friends some sensitive data of the user, or to hide the company information. And this is using the Symfony expression language. Essentially, in this case, I'm taking a service, and this service, depending if it returns true or false, in this case, the email of the user is visible only to the user itself. So even if I'm friend with him, I will not be able to see. So I'm saying to the connection permission service that I will not show. Just, is the currently logged in user the same of this? If yes, will be true. If not, will be false. So this field will be exposed or not. This is using the same strategy, just in this case, the last active field I have decided to show it if we are friends. So I have implemented a method called canShareInfo that knows the currently logged in user because has the token interface that we saw in the controller. And again, this method will just see if they are friends. If they are friends, will return true. If they are not, return false. And with this way, I can then dynamically decide which fields are exposed and which fields are not exposed. And again, I'm not saying what are the rules to do it. Again, it's not responsibility of the entity decide. I can perfectly decide if your business account or some enterprise, you see everything, even if you're not friend. And this is coded into the service. It's not the responsibility of the entity, so I will not put it here, and I will not put it in the controller. And at the end of the serialization process, you will get this. Relatively simple and okay. Yes?
Do you have a public API for this? So how you are managing the security if a user wants to access?
Public API like documentation? Or
no, I mean if I want to use your API.
Ah, yes. The thing is that here I'm not implying how you are connected. You can be connected via website, via JSON token, JWT token, or you can be connected via open authentication, so you're consuming the API from a third-party service via mobile or whatever. Here, I'm not saying how you are connected. So depending on how the connection, for that reason, I even said at the beginning, the authentication is not part of the business logic, in my opinion. So if you are consuming the API through the website, at the end, you have just Google Chrome or Firefox or whatever asking to the API something and sending maybe the cookie or maybe the JWT token or whatever. And this is how the API knows who are you. So even this application can even ignore this object and return true, so everything is synchronized, is serialized. So the security of which field to expose is completely into this service. So whatever the logic you like to put in that service is going to decide your security level. I don't know if it's the answer to your question.
For example, I want to access the Google API. So I need to have a Gmail account, and then I need to have a token key and these things. How you give access?
Obtaining a token is a different concept. You can obtain an open out token visiting some page, and you will have some URL that you will have a header. You can have a password authentication. So how you get the token and all these things are not part of this problem, because the token is something different because it's not like is different. Authorization and authentication are two different concepts. Authorization is part of the application. Authentication often is not part of the application. So we can, if you want, we can talk about it later. I will be really happy, but I don't know, probably 20 minutes. Okay, so that's all. Company, I will go a bit faster, is identical to the previous case. I'm just adding a couple of annotations to what I had before. Again, here I'm saying, am I allowed to share this information? In this case, I'm asking object get created by, so I'm asking not this user, but since this method was has as first parameter a user, I'm just taking the who created this company. If they are friends, then also the other person will be able to see the company information, like the link of the company. So again, I'm just composing the services I said before. And again, I will get here this, and depending if I'm friend or not with this user, I will see or not see the link. And so on for each entity of this. And to handle the security is just adding a couple of annotations on these entities, and that's all. Hey to us, this is how to build these nice links that I said at the beginning. And using this nice library that is again is built on top of the GMS serializer, adding some nice annotations on top of the entity, in this case the user, will just add some link. And in this case, we'll add a link called self that will have as URL the route of the user get that we created in the user controller to get the user. And the ID that, because we remember we need an ID of the user that we want to get, is object.getID. And repeating this is just how to have the conversations of this user is, again, taking the name of the route of that controller and providing the parameters that are necessary. And or here how to put, how to create a connection. Again, I'm providing the parameters that are necessary. I can use untemplated URI that is a way to skip some parameters. So if I want the graphic, the front-end designer to have that field dynamic, for example, I have the friend, so you can just put the friend ID there without taking care of the URL, but he knows the friend ID. I can just say the ID is dynamic and it's called user, and this will not have the user ID, but will have a placeholder. And the front-end developer can just replace the part of string with the placeholder. Again, this is not something custom because this is an RFC specification. There are a ton of libraries, multi-language, like JavaScript, Python, C++, or whatever, that handle this URL with these special placeholders, because you can even define that this parameter is optional, is mandatory. There are a lot of interesting things, and these are just standard.
Have you used the REST bundle?
Yes, this view, as I said, the new view that I was returning, is part of the REST bundle.
But it doesn't support anglers, like
It does. Yeah.
Or is it reading those annotations?
In this case, I've used annotation for commodity, but most of this stuff can be used as YAML or XML. So generally, I prefer to use annotation in custom project. If it's some open source library, of course, then I tend to use XML or YAML. But Hey2Us bundle is connected to the GMS serializer. So since FOSS-REST bundle supports GMS serializer, each feature of the GMS serializer is also available for REST bundle. And what I will get from this set of annotation is just this section. This was done by the GMS serializer, and the Hey2Us bundle has added just some links. Here I have skipped, but there are a lot of interesting things that can be, like, you can define an optional. This can be like some link can be available or not depending on security conditions, or any service just if can return true or false, you will see this link or not. Or there are groups. There are many interesting strategies to define which links show in the entity. Another case is the company. Here I have the self and the logo. This is some interesting thing. The logo can be something stored on some CDN, can be some dynamic method. And I don't want a front-end developer knowing the CDN URL. Maybe if I change it, I need to change the code and everything. I can just create a route or even type manually the URL here. And this will be just a link of the logo of that company. And this is something also interesting, we'll see it now, is embedding a relation in as link. And this is what we have. We have the link as before, and then we have embedded created by. And here we have the user that has created this company. This is interesting when you have, you want to keep clean your API, so I want to return only the company, but I know that 99% of the cases I will need to know to show on the front end who created that company. So instead of making an extra query or making dirty the return of my code, I can just add some embedded resources in this JSON. And this is the whole user. And as you can see here, is following again the whole set of serialization rules as before. So the user has again respected the security things, and also the links are there. If user has also some embedded stuff, will be embedded, and so on. And so on, like, is adding this annotation on each of your entities, you get the serialization thing. Can you put me the battery here? It's running out of battery. So, looks boring, but it's just adding stuff on top of it. HTTP input is how to validate and how to handle which fields are possible to be set on entities. And here I have used Symfony form, as I already said before. This is the user type, and this was the object that I was instantiating at the very, very beginning of the controller. Symfony form is a really tricky component. A lot of people hate it. It's really, really complex, especially if you have complex relations. And the problem with this component is if you don't do it right, you will get easily lost. But is extremely powerful, and what it allows to do is great. In this case, I'm handling only the types for the user, like what field is possible to set through the REST API, like name, email, biography, the place where he lives. And okay, here there are some configuration. This is important if you send the whole object. This essentially it allows to ignore the underscore embedded and underscore link relations. This for me was useful just because I was receiving the user from the first REST endpoint and sending it back in whole to the put method or to the post, and I just need to ignore these two custom fields. Answer to the question of the security is here you can perfectly use dependency injection and inject any service that you want in this method, and to decide in which situation am I allowed to set the field email. If you don't set email here and the user is setting it, you will get an error, like validation error, that you are not allowed to send the field email. And this is one way of doing the security. There are probably many other ways, but this is just one of them. And this is what is just an example of HTTP request. I'm doing a post with these fields, email and ID, and links will be ignored, as I said, and that's all. Company is identical. Generally, Symfony is pretty good to guessing the field type, but if not, if you have some relatively complex field type, if they are entities, you can add options. You have mainly two parameters to add options like validation rules. The validation rule, we'll see them even later. But generally, you can define some option. Example, in this case, publish is not a string, is not a boolean, it's just a checkbox. That would be true, false as HTTP. And this, again, is the same. I'm posting the company, the whole JSON object I have received before, and it will just work. And so on for each form type that I have just to create this object, and nothing more than it. How to validate fields? Using Symfony Validator, again, is on top of the old annotation that we have added before. We can just add some annotation saying this has to be an email, and even check the host that is a valid email. Must not be blank, the name must be 3 characters long, and there are, example, this, the email needs to be unique in the database, and it's possible to create custom validators. It's even possible to call methods of services of this class to validate this object. And again, what I like from it is that is declarative, so there is no some kind of logic, but is always found some advantages in declarative languages versus procedural or whatever the object-oriented languages. But this is my personal opinion. In this case, if the user is valid, we'll see we had the method if valid true will return the user, otherwise we'll turn the validation errors. And this is what you will get as validation errors as JSON. You will get some generic message and then a list of errors fields with possible errors that occur there. Of course, each field can have multiple error types, multiple error messages. You can decide by the option that I said.
Your form.
Here, huh?
In your form example, you were calling the form object to see if it's a valid form. Is it using the entity annotations, or does that happen on persistent flush?
There is using the annotation. So is in that moment.
It's looking at the entity.
Yeah. Not on the flash. It's going at the very beginning.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Or not during persistent.
No. It's doing it at. Is doing it at form level, because it's possible to add here even for some specific fields. If you don't want to add it in the entities, you can define them even in the form. Okay. But the validation happens at form level. Just here, since everything is optional, the form goes to extract the validation from the entity, because I have defined here that this form is about the company class.
Right. And then if I have a more complex domain where the application sometimes sets those fields, do the annotations also apply when I try to say to Doctrine?
No, like Doctrine does not do validation.
Yeah.
Doctrine is not built for validation. Whatever if you want to validate your object with Doctrine, you have to create a custom event listener and a ton of stuff that I really don't suggest you to do. Okay. Because validation is not a database issue, because if you have different endpoints manipulating the same user, you might have different validation rules. Imagine you have an API endpoint for some enterprise API and an endpoint for some cheap API something. And in different APIs, you might have mandatory the email or not. So validation is not an entity issue. And if you have validation by, in this case, you can put them in the forms, or you can split them in different validation groups and put them on the entity. But it's really up to you, because validation is not something that is connected to doctrine. It's more to the HTTP framework that you use on top of it. That's probably also why every framework has its own validation, because validation is something more framework specific. Okay. Before you get this nice JSON as errors that you can pass. Company, identical as before, identical set of errors, and that's all. Authorization is the part of how to handle security of what I'm allowed to edit or do with application. And again, this is done with Symfony security. It's a pretty big component. But in this case, I've shown only the security voter that are the component that decide if I'm allowed to edit a user or to add a user. To do that, I have already specified in all the controllers that add security annotation that I put some privilege and the entity that is necessary to be like checked. In this case, this is the company voter. If you remember, I had like, am I allowed to create a company? Am I allowed to edit a company? This is just one single method that has to vote to say yes or not if I'm allowed to edit that company. And in this case, if I'm not logged in, obviously I'm not allowed to edit the company, so false. And then, am I allowed to create the company? Ask to this method. This method is some complex logic. In my case, is my rules. Maybe I can create it if I have some business account, if I'm already registered, or if I'm the owner of another company. These are custom business rules. Can I edit? Can I delete? Can I view? And if I reach this code, this means that there is something wrong. That's all. This is how the whole security is handled. I create just a lot of these classes, and each of them is responsible for one entity. Technically, it's possible to create classes that are responsible for multiple entities, or I had even an example. Company create is a privilege that does not require a company, because I'm creating a company. So in this case, if you see, I'm not, subject is the company, and can be null. This can be null as parameter. So it's just some custom logic to decide if I'm allowed to create a company. And copying and pasting this code for deciding if I'm allowed to create users, if I'm allowed to create app events, that's all that needs to be done. And the good part of it is that I have different classes, different part of my code that are responsible for different things, because probably the rule, if I'm allowed to create a user, will be different from the rule that to create a company. If they are the same, I can just implement them in the same method. But in my case, they were always different. But that's the idea, that I have one specific place where to handle all the security things. I'm almost at the end. Documentation, using this bundle, and having defined all the security rule by annotation, having defined all the routes, having defined all the validation, having all the code that we wrote till now, this bundle is able to create a really great result. Adding just one, we can put this annotation just an empty, but I like just to document more code. I have decided this is a resource. Then what is a resource is a bit tricky. For me, a resource is like get, post, put, but a collection is not technically a resource. But this is debatable. I can add some interesting documentation to what this action is doing. In this case, the action is saves a user. This is just documentation of my code. Is a resource, is in a section user, so they will be grouped in by documentation. The possible return codes are this, and in which situation which code is returned. It takes an user type. We had the form called user type, and it outputs a user. Having set all this stuff for each of our methods, we get automatically, without doing anything, this. We have a sandbox, we have some security information, we have validation rule for parameter. This way you can define validation rule for your input parameter, and they are already documented here. You can have versions, description of each field, status codes, and so having done the first part of the code well, that anyway was looking for me necessary to be done well, we get even for free this documentation. And especially there is no code involved to get it, no workflow, no, just visiting /API/doc, and you get it for free. Of course, can be even statically generated if you want to put it on a CDN or whatever. And for each endpoint that we have defined, that annotation is, which will be exposed in the documentation. What to take home from all this really long talk? I have used a ton of different libraries, and these are just the libraries that I was talking about. Probably I've skipped example how I was sending emails or many other things. But for my personal thing is that open source is awesome. Like I was able to build a whole website API, like with probably of my line of code, of my ideas, maybe per 100 line of code. Everything else was just composing small pieces and pieces, and to get a fully working application that was able to connect different users to organize events and make sponsorship. And the idea is that using small libraries that do only one thing, and they do it possibly well, and that can be glued together, we can achieve a really interesting result, because all the steps that I show were possible just because each of these components was integrated well with another one, or was small enough that allowed other user, like library maintainers, framework editors, whatever, to compose this. Because if I have an incredibly big library that does everything, probably just it will not fit well in another framework, in another library. So the idea was that many small good decisions at the end allowed to produce a relatively big result with not such a big effort. And from my side, that's all. Thank you.